The Mishnah in Yuma on Daf Pehei Omid Beis. Misa v'yom Kippurim mechaprim im hatshuva. The Mishnah says that there are times when Misa and Yom Kippurim achieve kapara together with tshuva. And the Mishnah then details tshuva mechaperes al averes kalos. Tshuva can be mechaper alone without Yom Kippurim or Misa on averes, which the Mishnah categorizes as kalos. And in a moment we'll see what the definition of kalos is. Ala aseh va'alois aseh va'ala chamurois hu toile ad sheyovoy Yom Kippurim v'yechaper. But chamurois require a combination of tshuva and Yom Kippurim to achieve kapar. The Gemara later on Daf Pei Vav Amud Aleph in Yuma brings a brisa. Shomata arba chilukei kapara shahoyer b'shmol doirish. There are 4 chilukei kapara, 4 categories of tshuva which are b'shmol defined. Tshuva im kol echad ve'echad, and each one requires tshuva in conjunction with something else. Ovar al aseh v'shov, if a person was merely over an aseh, tshuva alone is sufficient to be mechaper. Einei zoz misham ad shemoichem loi. Over al loisa aseh v'osa tshuva, if he was over on a loisa aseh and then did tshuva toila v'yom kippurim mechaper. In the case of a loisa aseh, tshuva is not sufficient, it requires a combination of tshuva and Yom Kippurim. And therefore it would seem apparent from making the brisa consistent with the Mishnah which we just discussed, and as we'll see, that's the way the Rambam paskins this sugya in Hilchos Tshuva, that the kalos which the Mishnah mentions, that tshuva alone is sufficient to be mechaper, applies to mitzvahs esei and lav hanitak la'aseh, whereas the chamuros which require a combination of Yom Kippurim and tshuva refers to lois aseh. The third of the chilukei kapara is over al krisois umisois beistin ve'osa tshuva. If he was over on an avera which is mechayev kares umisas bezdin, tshuva v'yom kippurim toilin v'yisurim emarkim. The kapara is finalized by a combination of tshuva, Yom Kippurim, and yisurim. Aval mishi yesh biyodei chilul Hashem, the fourth of the chilukei kapara, ein loy koyach b'tshuva litlois v'yom kippurim lechaper v'loy b'yisurim lemarek ela kulam toilim umisam emarekes. So to summarize, we have the 4 chilukei kapara, all of which require tshuva. For a mitzvahs esei, tshuva achieves immediate kapara. For a lois aseh, is what's required is a combination of tshuva and Yom Kippurim. For krisos and misas bezdin, a combination of tshuva, Yom Kippurim, and yisurim. And for the avoin of chilul Hashem, tshuva, Yom Kippurim, yisurim, and misa. The Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos in Yuma, in explaining the Mishnah of kalos and chamuros, the Rambam adds the following. He says, "V'kol zeh keshe'ein avodas Yom Kippurim." The chilukei kapara listed by the Mishnah and by the Brisa only apply where there is no performing of the avodas Yom Kippurim in the Beis Hamikdash. Aval bizman shahoisa ha'avoda, in the time when avodas Yom Kippurim was performed, kvar yodato ki besoir hamishtaleach hoyu miskaprim al kol ha'avonos, the soir hamishtaleach achieved kapara of all the avonos, kemosh mevar betchilas Shavuos, as will be explained in the beginning of Shavuos. The Rambam is referring to the Mishnah in Shavuos on Daf Beis Amud Beis, where the Mishnah lists the kapara of the various seirim that come at different times. And the Mishnah says, Al shar averos shebatayra, on all averos shebatayra, hakalos, chamuros, zdoinos, shkogos, asei velois asei, krisos and misas beistin, so'ir hamishtaleach mechaper. The so'ir hamishtaleach is mechaper. Now, on this Mishnah, which states that the so'ir of Yom Kippurim is mechaper on both asay, the first of the 4 categories of the Adal Chiluki Kapara, lois asay, the second category, krisos umisas bezdin, the third, and we'll see Be'ezer Hashem further about the 4th category of Chilul Hashem. The Gemara asks the following question. The Mishnah lists among the categories which the So'ir of Yom Kippurim accomplishes kapara for is Chayve Asay. The Gemara asks on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis of Shavuos, why do we require the So'ir HaMishtaleach to achieve kapara for mitzvahs Asay? Rabbi Shmuel said in the first of the Chiluke Kapara that if someone was mevatel and asay, the din is Tshuva is mechaper immediately. So the Gemara asks him Mimonavshach, Id ovad Tshuva, if the person performed Tshuva, kol yoimonami, we don't require the soyer of Yom Kippurim. Id loy ovad Tshuva, if the person did not do tshuva, says the Gemara, zevach rishoim toyeva. Says Rashi, zevach rishoim toyeva, vehechi mechaper alei karban Yom Kippurim. We're discussing the kapara of the Soyer HaMishtaleach. The Soyer HaMishtaleach, says Rashi, is considered a carbon. And just like any carbon which comes to achieve kapara, cannot do so without tshuva, and we'll see this brought by and pasken by the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva. Says the Gemara, the Soyer HaMishtaleach, even though it's not Karav al HaMizbeach, says Rashi, for the din of Zevach Rishoim Toyeva is also considered carbon, and therefore if he did not do tshuva, then the Soyer HaMishtaleach will not achieve kapara of him anyway. So we must be speaking about a case where tshuva was performed, and if that's the case, we don't require the Soyer HaMishtaleach. To which the Gemara answers, Omar Reb Zeira ba'oimeid b'maradoi v'rebihi. Simple meaning of the intention of the Gemara is that the Gemara is saying that were he to have done tshuva, einochanami, we would not require the Soyer HaMishtaleach. Where this Mishnah is describing a case where he did not perform tshuva, ba'oimeid b'maradoi, he is still maintaining his merida. And therefore, says the Gemara, the Mishnah is only consistent with Rebbe, who says that Soyer la'azazel, the Soyer HaMishtaleach, the Soyer of Yom Kippurim, is an exception to the rule of Zevach Rishoim Toyeva, and even in a case of Oimed b'Mardoi, Soyer HaMishtaleach will accomplish kapara, and Rebbe proves this from Gzeres HaKosuv, by which the Gemara then goes on to derive that Rebbe shows from Sukkim that there are clearly only 3 cases in which, by virtue of Gzeres HaKosuv, the Soyer HaPnimi, the Soyer HaMishtaleach cannot accomplish kapara, and therefore Rebbe says by inference, for all other Averas, despite not having done tshuva, the Soyer HaMishtaleach will accomplish kapara. Seemingly, therefore, the maskana of the Gemara is that according to the Rabbanon who argue with Rebbe, which as we'll see is the opinion which the Rambam paskins in Yad, in Hilchos Tshuva, the Soyer HaPnimi cannot be mechaper without tshuva. In which case, according to the Rabbanon, we then have to revert back to the original question that if the Soyer HaPnimi requires tshuva anyway to be mechaper, so what then is the difference between Yom Kippurim without a Soyer HaMishtaleach or Yom Kippurim with a Soyer HaMishtaleach? Yom Kippurim, we saw in the Mishnah in Yuma and in the Dalad Chiluke Kapara that Yom Kippurim for Chamurais requires tshuva. And if there is tshuva present, then Yom Kippurim is mechaper without the soyer. So if the soyer needs tshuva, as is mavur in the Gemara, that it's only Rebbe that holds that soyer HaMishtaleach is an exception and doesn't require tshuva. But according to the Rabbanon, soyer HaPnimi is no different to any other carbon, and requires tshuva in conjunction with it in order to accomplish kapara. So then how is a Yom Kippur with a Soyer HaPnimi and Yom Kippur without a Soyer HaPnimi different? And the answer is that the difference will be in a case of the 3rd category of the Chiluke Kapara, which is the case of Krisos and Misos Bezdin. That whereas Krisos and Misos Bezdin, by virtue of Tshuva and Yom Kippurim alone, will not accomplish Kapara. The Bryce of the Da'ad Chalukah Kapara stated that for Krisos and Misais Bezdin, we don't just require Tshuva and Yom Kippurim, but we require Yisurim. So therefore, the Soira Pnime of Yom Kippurim with the Tshuva will accomplish a full Kapara on Krisos and Misais Bezdin, whereas a Yom Kippurim without the Soira will require an addition of Yisurim. We can also consider the possibility that the fourth category of Chilul Hashem, which requires a combination of Tshuva, Yom Kippurim, Yisurim, and Misa to be Mechaper, perhaps Soir of Yom Kippurim will be Mechaper for Chilul Hashem also. B'Anius Daiti, I was not able to find a clear Maramakim for this question in the Rishonim, but the language, the Lashon of the Rambam in the beginning of Hilchos Tshuva seems to imply that the capacity of the Soyer to be Mechaper, together with Tshuva, would extend even to the fourth category of the Chiluki Kapara, namely even to Chilul Hashem. The Rambam says, Soyer Mishtaleach Mechaper al Kol Averes Shabbatayra. Kalois, Chamurois, Ben She'ovar Bezodoin, Ben She'ovar Beskogo, Hakoil, the Rambam emphasizes, Miskaper Besoyer Mishtaleach, V'hu She'osa Tshuva. The fact that the Rambam brings not just the language of the Mishnah and Shavuos of Soyer Mishtaleach Mechaper al Kol Averes Shabbatayra, but then adds for emphasis, Hakoil Miskaper Besoyer Mishtaleach, would seem to be mashma that there is no exception to the capacity of the Soyer Mishtaleach to be Mechaper, which would seemingly imply that the Soyer Mishtaleach would be Mechaper even for Chilul Hashem. So to summarize, we have the Mishnah and the Sugya in Yuma on Daf Peheu and Beis and Pevav of the four Chiluki Kapara, which the Rambam in Perishah Mishnaya says apply only in absence of a Soyer Mishtaleach. And there we have four Chiluki Kapara, Chayvei Esei, which Tshuva alone is Mechaper without Yom Kippurim, Lois Asei, Tshuva and Yom Kippurim, Krisos and Misas Bezdin, Tshuva, Yom Kippurim and Yisurim, and the fourth category of Chilul Hashem, where it's Tshuva, Yom Kippurim, Yisurim, and Misa. The Sugi in Shavuos, based on the Mishnah on Beis and Beis, states in its straightforward reading that the Soyer Mishtaleach requires the addition of Tshuva in order to be Mechaper, and therefore seemingly the Soyer Mishtaleach has no impact on the first two of the Da'ad Chiluki Kapara, namely Asei, in which Tshuva alone is Mechaper, and Lois Asei, in which Tshuva and Yom Kippurim would be Mechaper despite the absence of the Soyer. The difference which the Soyer Mishtaleach would make would be in the third category of Krisos and Misas Bezdin, which ordinarily would require Yisurim, and the Soyer HaMishtaleach would be Mechaper just based on a combination of Tshuva and Yom Kippurim, and possibly for Chilul Hashem also. When we look further in the Rambam though, we see that the Rambam has a remarkable Chiddush, which the Kesef Mishnah says seems to flatly contradict the Gemara in Shavuos, which we just saw. The Rambam says, Hakoil miskaper b'sar mishtaleach, the Lashon of the Rambam we read before, that any form of Avera, and as we were Medaik, would seem to include even Chilul Hashem, Kapara is achieved through the Sar Mishtaleach, says the Rambam, V'hu she'asa tshuva, with the condition of tshuva, which seems to be consistent with the Gemara and Daf Yud Beis and Beis, that were tshuva to be absent, according to the Rabbanon, the principle of Zebach Rishayim Te'eva would apply, and as Rashi says, how could the carbon of Yom Kippurim he'echi chaper alei carbon Yom Kippurim? However, the Rambam continues, and the Rambam says, Aval im loy asa tshuva, in the absence of tshuva, ein hasoir mechaper loy ela al hakalois. The soyer can accomplish kapara, but can accomplish kapara only on kalois. Says the Rambam, umahen hakalois. Kalois, says the Rambam, shar mitzvahs loy sasei umitzvahs sasei she'ein bahem kores hein hakalois. So the Rambam says clearly that not just is the Soyer of Yom Kippurim mechaper b'loy tshuva on mitzvahs asei, but is mechaper even on mitzvahs loy sasei. Kesef Mishnah asks, how could that be? The Gemara says mefurish that b'loy asa tshuva the zevach rishayim toyeva. Kashali zot the Kesef Mishnah the hosa mashma de l'Rabbanon afilu over asei im loy asa tshuva in Soyer mechaper. v'tzarechim. So the Kesef Mishnah remains with the question that the Rambam contradicts the Gemara. To be able to possibly suggest a yishuv for the Rambam, we need to then address two questions. And we'll see that the Achronim attempt to address primarily one of the questions, and the second question is less discussed by the Achronim, and Be'ezer Hashem, we will attempt to be miyashev both questions. The first question is, where did the Rambam see a makar, see a source, to make this distinction between kalois and chamuros? Namely, that kalois, mitzvah saseh and lois saseh, the soira mishtaleh can be mechaper with no tshuva, in the absence of tshuva, whereas chamuros, krisos and misas bezdin, and possibly chil Hashem, can have a kapara even, and only where there is tshuva. Where does that distinction come from? There doesn't seem to be any basis in the Gemara and Shavuos to distinguish in the principle of Zevach Rishon Toyeva of the Sar being able to mechaper without tshuva between kalos and chamuros. That's not mentioned in the Gemara. Secondly, even were we to find a proof for this distinction that the Rambam makes between kalos and chamuros, and that the Sar Mishtaleach will be mechaper on kalos, namely aseh and lois aseh, despite the absence of tshuva, we then still have to resolve the question of the Gemara and Shavuos Daf Yud Beis and Mem Beis, that why wouldn't the principle of Zevach Rishon Te'eva apply? Rashi seems to say that this is a principle that applies to Karbanos that mechaper, v'heichi mechaper alei korban Yom Kippurim. How could the korban of Yom Kippurim be mechaper? So how is the Rambam justified in saying that Soyer HaMishtaleach would be able to be mechaper even on kalois without tshuva? So we'll begin by discussing three possibilities for the Rambam's source to make the distinction between, for his distinction between kalos and chamuros, and then Be'ezer Hashem will go on to discuss how the Rambam will resolve the principle of Zevach Rishon Te'eva. The first hechrach that we'll discuss is suggested by the Maratz Chiyas, or Perish Chayes, in Shavuos on Daf Ches. The Maratz Chiyas says that the Rambam was forced to conclude that there are cases where the Sora Mishtaleach would be mechaper without tshuva from based on a Gemara in Krisos on Daf Chavav Amud Aleph. The Gemara in Krisos discusses the possibility of Yom Kippurim exonerating someone from Chiyuv Malkus. The Gemara has a Shakla Bataria discussion if Yom Kippurim would create a ptur for Chatos and Osham, and the Gemara concludes it doesn't. And then the Gemara says even though it may not create, namely Yom Kippurim may not create a ptur for Chatos and Osham, the Gemara considers a possibility that would create a ptur for Malkus. And the Gemara discusses the difference between Yom Kippurim accomplishing a ptur for Malkus and Yom Kippurim not accomplishing a ptur for Chatas v'Asham. And the Gemara's maskana is, the Gemara concludes that Yom Kippurim cannot exonerate someone from Malkus, and the Gemara brings a pasuk to that effect, a drasha. The Maratz Chiyas says that the Rambam had a basic kasha, a basic problem with the Gemara considering even the possibility that Yom Kippurim will exonerate someone from Malkus, and the fact that the Gemara can only conclude that it doesn't by virtue of Gzeres HaKosov. And he says this is the problem. The Gemara in Makkas, on Daf Yud Gimel and Beis, in the beginning of Perek Elon Haloikin, establishes a principle that even though in Oinshim Bidei Shomayim, for example, Misa Bidei Shomayim Ukaris, if a person does tshuva, Shomayim may exonerate him from the Einesh, he'll be potter. But in Oinshim that are given to Beis Din, for example, Malkus Umisa, despite the fact that a person may have done tshuva, Beis Din does not take that into consideration, and the person has to be given the Einesh which he is chayiv. Says the Maratz Chiyas, if Yom Kippurim, namely the Sora Mishtaleach, would only be able to accomplish kapara in combination with tshuva. Therefore, says the Maratz Chiyas, for the Gemara to consider the possibility that Yom Kippurim would exonerate someone from Malchus, the Gemara, by definition, is considering the possibility of exonerating someone from a Bezdin-imposed punishment, a Bezdin-administered punishment, by virtue of a combination of Yom Kippurim and Tshuva. But doesn't that contradict the principle of the Gemara in Makis that Tshuva can never be a factor in Bezdin releasing someone from an Einish? So how could the Gemara in Krisos have a Havamina, and in fact only dismiss that Havamina by virtue of Exeres HaKosov? That there's a possibility that Yom Kippurim would exonerate someone from Malchus. If Yom Kippurim requires a combination of Yom Kippurim and Tshuva, that means we require the Tshuva to be a factor in allowing Bezdin to release the person from Malchus. But Bezdin can never release a person from an Einish based on Tshuva. That principle is established by the Gemara in Makis. So says the Maratz Chias, that Gemara in Krisos is proof that had Yom Kippurim been mechaper, it would be mechaper on a Chayev Malchus without Tshuva. And hence the Rambam saying that the Sora Mishtalech is mechaper even on Loisase without Tshuva, and therefore the Gemara in Krisos has a Havamina that Yom Kippurim, the Sora Mishtalech would be able to be mechaper to give someone a p'tur from Malchus because Yom Kippurim is mechaper below Tshuva, and therefore it doesn't stand in contradiction to the principle of the Gemara in Makis that Bezdin can never exonerate someone from an Einish by resorting to Tshuva. So says the Maratz Chias, the Gemara in Krisos is a proof to Rambam's position that at least for Loisase, which would involve Malchus, Yom Kippurim would be mechaper without Tshuva. This is the suggestion that the Maratz Chias makes as a proof and a source of the Rambam's Chidush, that the Gemara in Shavuos that says that the Mishnah that allows for Kapara Sora without Tshuva is only Rebbe, applies only to categories 3 and 4 of the Da'at Chiluke Kapara, namely Krisis and Misas Bezdin, and possibly Chil Hashem, but not to Chayve Ese and Loisase. Those, the Sora can be mechaper without Tshuva. There is a Ha'ara, a possible Makam Iyun, in this Chidush of the Maratz Chias. The Maratz Chias has made an assumption that the tshuva that we would be required together with Yom Kippurim, that form of tshuva falls under the same category as the tshuva being addressed by the Gemara in Makis, the Gemara in Daf Gimel Beis, that Bezdin cannot exonerate someone from an Einish based on tshuva. We could possibly make a clear distinction between the two different discussions of tshuva. And that is based on the Noida B'Yehuda in Orach Chaim Kama. The Noida B'Yehuda in Tshuva and Orach Chaim explains that the logic, the svara of the Gemara in Makis Daf Gimel Beis, that Bezdin cannot use Tshuva as a basis for exonerating someone from an Einish Bezdin, is because in order for the Tshuva to accomplish what the Misas Bezdin has to accomplish, the Tshuva has to be a thorough and fully cleansing, fully accomplishing kapara in order for it to exonerate the person from Misas Bezdin. Ordinarily we say, as the Mishnah says in Sanhedrin, to him, Misasi kapara alav enoisa. Kiven shenikla haleru koachicha, we say in the case of Malchus. Undergoing the Einesh of Bezdin achieves kapara. Says the Noida B'Yehuda, if we want to use the tshuva process to substitute for that kapara, Bezdin would have to have some way to ascertain that the process of tshuva had been so thorough that it had cleansed the person in the way that would be equivalent to what would be accomplished by the Einish Bezdin. And therefore, says the Noida B'Yehuda, the Gemara understands that Bezdin, who can never know that, can never substitute tshuva for an Einish. Bezdin can never know whether tshuva was thorough enough to be able to substitute for Misas or Malchus, Misas Bezdin or Malchus. Now, the tshuva which would be required together with the Sara Mishtalech That tshuva that would be required together with the Sorah Mishtaleach is entirely different to a tshuva that would have to substitute for a Misas Bezdin. In the case of the Sorah Mishtaleach, the Sorah HaMishtaleach would be the engine of Kapara. The tshuva would merely be a condition for that Kapara to go into effect. And the proof for that is, and we'll see this Be'ezer Hashem further, is that every chatos and osham, every korban that's mechaper, requires a tshuva to accompany it. As the Rambam says explicitly in the beginning of Hilchos Tshuva, when the Rambam discusses vidya and tshuva, he says, "V'chein ba'alei chatois va'ashamois be'eis shemeviyim korbaneseim al shigigosam oy al zedoinom," certain cases of ashamois, "e miskape lehem bekarbonom ad sheyasu tshuva v'yisvadi vidu dvarim." Every korban requires a condition of tshuva. Yet there's no issue in koyanim accepting someone's korban and don't have to question whether or not the person's tshuva was genuine. As long as the person was misvade b'peh, they carried out the ikrei tshuva, the maaseh tshuva is the condition for the korban. The engine of the kapara, what accomplishes all the kapara, will be the korban itself. And so too, it's reasonable to assume that if the Sorah HaMishtaleach required the combination of tshuva, it's analogous to the combination of a korban and tshuva, where the tshuva is a condition but not the mechaper. The mechaper remains the Sorah, the tshuva is a condition, just like the Rambam stated in the case of chatos va'osham, that the mechaper is a tshuva, the mechaper is the korban, and tshuva is a condition, a t'nai. So in the same way as in the case of chatos va'osham, the t'nai of tshuva does not require that extent of tshuva that the tshuva itself should be mechaper, so too in Sorah Mishtaleach it would be reasonable to assume the same thing. In which case, the parallel that the Maratz Chias draws between tshuva combined with Yom Kippurim not being able to exonerate someone from Malkus based on the principle of the Gemara in Malkus possibly doesn't hold true. The sugya in Malkus is discussing whether or not tshuva in itself can create a degree of kapara equivalent to the kapara that comes of Temi Sasi kapara or Kibin Shenikla Hareu Ka'achicha. But that's not the issue in the case of Sorah Mishtaleach. In the case of Sorah Mishtaleach, we're merely discussing, does the kapara of Sorah Mishtaleach require a condition of tshuva? In which case we could possibly differ with the assumption that the Maratz Chias makes. A second hechrich to the Rambam is that of Rameh Simcha in Meshech Chochma in Parshas Achremos. The Meshech Chochma quotes the Gemara in Yuma Daf Pehei Amud Beis, a little further from the Mishnah, where the Gemara asks the following shaila, the following kasha. We mentioned before, the Gemara in Shavuos quotes the opinion of Rebbe, that Yom Kippurim, the Sorah of Yom Kippurim, accomplishes kapara without tshuva. So the Gemara then asks, why does the Mishnah say that for chamuros, namely for loisase, we require a combination of tshuva and Yom Kippurim? Surely, according to Rebbe, Yom Kippurim achieves kapara without tshuva. So the Gemara says, Eino chanami afilu tema Rebbe, even if the Mishnah would be consistent with Rebbe, tshuva boya Yom Kippurim. Tshuva requires Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippurim la boya tshuva. The Mishnah is saying that tshuva alone can't accomplish kapara, but Yom Kippurim alone is sufficient. Says the Meshech Chochma, if that's correct, following this logic, we could say the following. In the case of kalois in the Mishnah and Yuma, where the Mishnah in Yuma says that kalois, tshuva alone is mechaper, for tshuva alone is sufficient. So if we see from the Gemara in analyzing Rebbe's shita, that Yom Kippurim is always a greater mechaper than tshuva, because Yom Kippur is mechaper without tshuva, but tshuva, even according to Rebbe, requires Yom Kippurim to complete it. So in the case of Kalos, where the Rabbanon agree that tshuva alone is mechaper, kol shekain that Yom Kippurim alone should be mechaper without tshuva. That's the cheshbon, that's the argument which Rameh Simcha makes. Now, the ha'ara on this approach of Ramei Simcha is that there's a difference between the kalois of the sugya in Yuma and the kalois of the sugya in Shavuos. And the inconsistency between the sugyas is pointed out by the Chasam Sofer in his Chidushim in Shavuos, but the difference is clear in the Rambam. The kalois of the first of the Chilukei Kapara, which the sugya in Yuma discusses where there is no soyer, and therefore, according to the Rabbanon, is mechaper even without tshuva, is clear, as we mentioned before in the Dal Chilukei Kapara, is only applicable to chayve esei. Kalois, it means chayve esei in the Dal Chilukei Kapara. Whereas in the sugya in Shavuos, that the Rambam says that the soyer can be mechaper even without tshuva, their kalois includes in it even loisase, as is mefurish in the Rambam that we read before. Umahina kalois, says the Rambam, the kalois are shar mitzvahs loisase umitzvahs ese. So in order to be able to justify kalois in the Rambam, we don't just have to explain that the soyer can achieve kapara on chayve ese without tshuva, but we have to explain a makar to be mechaper even on loisase without tshuva. On loisase without tshuva, we never find in the sugya in Yuma that the Chachamim said that it could be that tshuva could be mechaper without Yom Kippurim. In which case, Ramei Simcha's logic applies to kalois of asay, where since the Chachamim say that on kalois of asay tshuva alone is mechaper, so the soyer can certainly be mechaper on kalois of an essay without tshuva. But in the Rambam, that's seemingly not sufficient, because the Rambam includes in kalois even loisase, and loisase we don't find, according to the Chachamim, could be mechaper without tshuva. In fact, the simple reading of the Dal Chilukei Kapara says that loisase requires tshuva and Yom Kippurim, in which case we are still lacking a hechrech and a makar for the Rambam's chiddush that even on loisase the Sara Pnimi will be able to mechaper without tshuva. The third makar, which will suggest for Shittas Rambam that the soyer is mechaper on lois asay and asay without tshuva, is the hechrach of the Minchas Chinuch. The Minchas Chinuch in Mitzvah Shin Samach Daled says that both the lashon of the Mishnah in Shavuos and the lashon of the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva that we saw before seems to indicate that soyer apnimi accomplishes a unique kapara, not just for the third and possibly fourth categories of Da'at Chilukei Kapara, namely, as we said before, for krisos and misas bezdin, and possibly for chil Hashem, that doesn't require either yemak isurim or misa. But the lashon of the Mishnah in Shavuos, and that's a lashon of the Rambam, is that soyer apnimi changes the form of kapara even for esei and loisasei. The Rambam says, "Soyer mishtalech mechaper al kol averos shebatayra hakalois vehachamuros bein she'ava bezodoin bein she'ava b'shkogo hakol miskaper b'soyer mishtalech." The lashon of the Rambam, based on the Mishnah in Shavuos, seems to imply that even in kalois, the Mishnah is saying that the soyer apnimi achieves a different means of kapara than just tshuva and Yom Kippurim alone. And therefore, the obvious question is that in the case of kalois, Yom Kippurim is mechaper together with tshuva. So how then can we say that the soyer mishtalech achieves a degree of kapara, even on kalois, different than tshuva and Yom Kippurim? If we read the Gemara in Shavuos simply the way the Kesef Mishnah says, the only difference, as we explained before, between the kapara of Yom Kippurim with the soyer and without the soyer only applies to the third and possibly fourth categories of the Da'at Chilukei Kapara, namely chayve krisos and misas bezdin and chil Hashem. But for esei and lois asei, it doesn't change, because if one didn't do tshuva, zevach rishayim toyeva, and if one did do tshuva, then we don't require the soyer. Yom Kippurim alone would accomplish the kapara. Therefore, says the Minchas Chinuch, the Rambam was forced to conclude based on the lashon of the Mishnah in Shavuos, and that's what the Rambam is implying in his all-encompassing lashon, that soyer mishtaleach mechaper al kol averos shebatayra kalos v'chamuros, that even in kalos, the method and the means by which Soyer HaMishtalech is mechaper is different than Kapara and Yom Kippurim. And hence the Rambam's chidush that it's Soyer HaMishtalech is mechaper without tshuva. This is the hechrach of the Minchas Chinuch, which emerges from a straightforward reading of the Lashon of the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva. And the Minchas Chinuch is mukhrach. So at this point, we can therefore say that we have a hechrach to the Rambam, that the Rambam's hechrach was from the Lashon of the Mishnah in Shavuos, which is mevur, that the Soyer HaPnimi changes the kapara on essay and lois essay. And therefore, the Rambam was forced to conclude that therefore the Soyer HaPnimi must be mechaper on essay and lois essay without tshuva, because were it to require tshuva, then the Soyer HaPnimi would have no impact. So now possibly we can address the second of the two questions. Granted, the Minchas Chinuch has shown that the Rambam was forced to this chiddush, that the Soyer HaMishtalech changes the nature of kapara for kalos also based on the Mishnah in Shavuos, as is clear from the Lashon of the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva. But how do we resolve that with the din of Zevach Rishon Te'eva? To return to the Gemara in Shavuos, the Gemara began with a question that if Lo Osa Tshuva, says the Gemara, Zevach Rishon Te'eva, and Rashi says that applies to the Soyer HaMishtalech. Says Rashi, V'heichi mechaper alei karban Yom Kippurim. How does the Rambam then resolve the principle of Zevach Rishon Te'eva? What we will suggest in the Shittas Rambam will be the following chidush, Be'ezah Hashem. We will first suggest the general principle, and then afterwards add a svara. The Chasam Sofer makes a diuk in the Lashon of the Gemara. The Gemara originally presented two possibilities for how Soyer HaMishtalech could be mechaper. And the Gemara says, if Ovad Tshuva, then for Kalois, we don't require the Soyer HaMishtalech. Tshuva for essay is mechaper miyad. Iloi Osa Tshuva, says the Gemara, Zevach Rishon Te'eva. We'll recall that the Gemara resolves this problem by saying that the Mishnah is Rebbe, who is of the opinion that Soyer HaMishtalech is mechaper without tshuva on everything besides three categories of three unique situations of Aveira. The Gemara's Lashon, though, is puzzling, and this is diuk is made by the Chasam Sofer. Omar Reb Zera, Lashon of the Gemara that we saw before, Be'oimed b'mardoi. Why did the Gemara use that expression of oimed b'mardoi? Originally, when the Gemara suggested the two possibilities for the Mishnah in Shavuos, the Gemara said either osa tshuva or loy osa tshuva. Why then does the Gemara present loy osa tshuva with the expression of oimed b'mardoi? So to resolve that diuk of the Chasam Sofer, we'll suggest the following. This is the Chidush Be'ezah Hashem. We'll show a makar for the Chidush, and then Be'ezah Hashem suggests the Svar. The Rambam understood that there is a difference between Oimed B'mardoi and Loy Osa Tshuva. Loy Osa Tshuva means he did not fulfill the precepts of Tshuva. And Oimed B'mardoi means the person is still a Baal Aveira. The din of Zevach Rishon Te'eva, as it applies to Soyer HaMishtalech, is only in the case of Oimed B'mardoi. But in the case of Loy Osa Tshuva, there's a possibility that despite not having done Tshuva, as long as he's not Oimed B'mardoi, the Soyer will be Mechaper. The basis of this Chidush, that when the Rambam says Loy Osa Tshuva, he doesn't mean that he did nothing at all, and the person is chas v'shalom the same Baal Aveira as he was initially. But where the Rambam says that the Soyer HaMishtalech is mechaper on kalos b'lei tshuva, it means there was a certain degree of tshuva, so that such that he's not oimed b'mardoi, but he wasn't ovid tshuva entirely. The makar for this is mefurish in the Meiri in Chibur HaTshuva. The Meiri in Ma'amar Beis of Chibur HaTshuva Perek Yud Gimel says the following. He says, Ukvar yodato, she'ein sora mishtalech mechaper elo lashovim. The sora mishtalech only accomplishes kapara for those that do tshuva. Avol, mechaper hu lashovim al kol avoynois him kalim him chamurim. And it can accomplish a kapara greater than tshuva and Yom Kippurim because it's mechaper on all averos. Says the Rambam, says the Meiri, u'masha'omu b'ktsas mekayimos. And I don't know where the ktsas mekayimos are, but in the Sefer Avodas HaMelech, the Sefer Avodas HaMelech writes that there's a Yerushalmi in Shavuos, which seems to be a makar for the Shittas Rambam. But I don't know where the Mekayimos are. Says the Meiri, Shemechaper ala kalois af beloy tshuva, even though we find proofs that the soyer can be mechaper al kalois even below tshuva, namely this is the Shittas Rambam, that on kalois the soyer can be mechaper without tshuva. Says the Meiri Bir, what that means is, afal pi shaloi hisoyer tachlis ha'ara. He wasn't mekayim tshuva with finality, with completion. Ad sheyovoy mimeno lidei tshuva gemura. Says the Meiri, when the Rambam says like also tshuva, he means he didn't complete the process of tshuva. But what he is, says the Meiri, is afal pi shaloi hisoyer tachlis ha'ara. But the Meiri doesn't say what he does have to do. But what we see in the Meiri is a chidush nifla and the pesach to the Shittas Rambam. Namely, that when the Rambam says that the Soyer HaPnim is mechaper below tshuva, the Rambam never meant without tshuva entirely. Because that only Rebbe holds that by Oymid Memordoi, the Soyer HaPnim can be mechaper without tshuva. And that's what the Kesef Mishnah says, that the straightforward reading of the Gemara seems to make us conclude that Ba'umed, B'mordoi, Rabbanon will hold the Sarah, Mishtalech will not be Mechaper. Says the Meiri, that's true only in the case of Ba'umed, B'mordoi, in a case where he was not Shav at all. But if he was Shav with a certain degree of Ha'ara, even if he didn't reach Tachlis Ha'ara, Sheyova Mimeno Lidei Tshuva Gemura, in that case, the So'er will be Mechaper. So to summarize up to this point, we have now 2 points in Shittas Rambam. We have the makor for the Shittas Rambam that Soyer is mechaper b'lo tshuva on kalois in the Mishnah in Shavuos, which is mevur that even in kalois there is a difference in the process of kapara between Yom Kippurim with a Soyer and Yom Kippurim without a Soyer. Then we have, in addition, the Meiri that explains that the reason why this Rambam doesn't contradict Zebach Rishon Toyeva is because the Gemara is only discussing a case of Oymed B'mordoi, and there the machlokes between Rabbi and Rabbanan applies. But in a case of not Oymed B'mordoi, even if he wasn't Shav, there the Rabbanan will agree that the Sarah Pnimi is different. Namely, even though by all other karbonos, the Gemara in Zvachim on Davov, and the Gemara in pieces is mevur, that all karbonos require tshuva and vidui, and we saw this clearly in the lashon of the Rambam, that balei chatois v'ashomis be'ez shemevim karbonoseim require tshuva and vidui, which is tshuva shlema of all yikra tshuva and vidui, as the Rambam says in the beginning of Halacha Aleph. The Soyer HaPnimi, the Soyer Mishtalech is an exception to that only Oymed B'mordoi, the Gemara says, will create Zevach Rishon Toyeva, but not a lack of a tshuva shlema. The point which we'll conclude with Be'ezer Hashem is to try and suggest an exact hagdara, an exact definition of what the Meiri is referring to when he speaks about a tshuva which is not tachlis ha'ara. And the svara possibly for the Meiri may be this. In the Sefer Minchas Avram, in the last chelik on Yuma, Rabbi Avram Garbuz brings that he heard from Rebbeinu in the name of the Rav, the Brisker Rav, the following kasha and teretz on a Rambam in Hilchos Shgogos. The Rambam in Hilchos Shgogos in Perek Gimel Halacha Yud discusses the concept of a meva'et bekapara, someone who rejects the kapara capacity of something that's mechaper. The source of this Rambam is a Gemara in Krisos on Dav Zayin, where the Gemara says that someone who is mevayet in the kapara of his carbon, then a chatos and an osham, which is mechaper, if the person is mevayet b'kaparosai, the carbon is not mechaper. There is a basic difference in the Rishonim as to what the reason behind this is. Rashi in Krisos on Dav Zayin says that the reason for that is because there's exersa kosov underlying all carbonos, which is a Gemara in Kiddushin on Daf Nun, that the carbon has to be brought lirtsoinoi, ad sheyoimar roitzeani. A carbon only is meratze, a carbon only achieves kapara for the person who brings it in a case where the person brings it l'rotzon. If he's meva'it b'kaparosa, if he rejects it, says Rashi, the condition of l'rotzon has not been fulfilled, and the carbon will not be mechaper. Rashi, though, in Shavuos Daf Yud Gimel, says that the reason is because the person is lacking vidui. The person hasn't undergone the process of vidui and tshuva. And this explanation that Rashi gives, l'chayra, is shared by the Rambam in Shkogis Perek Gimel Halacha Yud, where the Rambam juxtaposes, the Rambam puts together the fact that chatos and osham isn't mechaper on someone who's mevayet b'kaparosam, and the same way Yom HaKippurim is not mechaper on someone who's mevayet b'kaparosam. Now, according to Rashi in Krisos, that the din of mevayet b'kapara only applies to a carbon because the carbon has a condition of l'ritzoneh. Yom HaKippurim has no such condition. So, but the Rambam who combines them clearly understands that if Yom HaKippurim and carbon have the same reasoning and are included in the same halacha and have the same underlying svara and tam, why someone who is mevayet in them, it will not be mechaper for, is mevur al derech Rashi and Shavuos that there is a part of the tshuva and the vidui missing in a mevayet kapara, and that's clear from the Rambam's lashon, as we'll see. Ein Yom HaKippurim, the Rambam says in Hilchos Perek Gimel Halacha Yud, Ein Yom HaKippurim v'lo yachatos v'lo osham mechaprim elo al hashovim hama'aminim b'kaparosam. On someone who is shov and is ma'amin in the kapara. Aval mevayet bohen ein mechaprim loy. That's the din that's mavur in the Rambam. Now the Brisker Rav asked a kasha on the next halacha which the Rambam brings. The Rambam brings hoya mevayet vehevi chatos hayashamli. If he brought his chatos and osham in a state of being mevayet, so says the Rambam, afa pishe karvu k'mitzvasam, even though the carbon was karev with no flaw in the avodah, loy niskaper loy, the carbon does not accomplish kapara, ukesheyachzor b'tshuva mi beitosoi, tzorich lahavi chatos hayashamli. When he then reverts away from his biot, then he has to bring a chatos and osham in place of the carbon that wasn't mechaper. The Brisker Rav then asked that the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva that we saw before brings that in order for chatos and osham to be mechaper, it requires vidui and tshuva. The Rambam says, V'chein ba'alei chatois v'ashamois be'ez shemevirim korbanesem asher gigasam, the Lashon Rambam which we learned earlier, ein miskapelem b'karbonam asher yasu tshuva v'yisvadu vidu dvarim shenemar v'yisvadu asher chata alea. And the Rambam says, if he brings the carbon without tshuva, the Rambam says, eina miskapelei asher yisvadu miloshu v'lasas kazeh loy. So the Brisker Rav asked, why in the case of the mevayet b'kapara does the Rambam say that not just is a mevayet b'kapara not subject to the kapara of the carbon, but the Rambam then adds that when he is chayzer from his biot, he then has to bring an additional carbon. Why doesn't the Rambam say the same thing in Hilchos Tshuva, that if someone brought a carbon without tshuva and vidui, when he is chayzer and he's shovu misvade, he should then bring the carbon, an additional carbon. So Rebbeinu said in the name of the Rav that what we see from this Rambam is that there's a fundamental difference between the lack of tshuva called a mevayet b'kapara than a lack of tshuva which is lacking vidui. He says, in the case of mevayet b'kapara, the carbon loses its entire capacity to be mechaper. And therefore the carbon was not a mechaper, and it's as though the carbon was never karev. And in fact, in Reb David Soloveitchik's Zvachim Shiurim on Davavim Beis, he brings that when the Rambam says Afal Pisha Karvu K'mitzvosam, possibly the Rambam means that Afal Pisha Karvu K'mitzvosam means, and the carbon is a carbon posel and it's nisraf. Not just that it's not meratza, but it's actually a carbon posel. Mevayet Bekapara actually creates psulim carbon because the carbon doesn't have any capacity to be defined as a carbon that's mechaper. Whereas in the case of the Rambam where we lack tshuva and vidui, in the Rambam and Hilchos Tshuva, in that case, says the Rambam, there, if a person is not mevayet, even though he still requires tshuva and vidui, in that case, the Briskirov is mechadish that the carbon is a carbon that is meratze. Just in order for him to be able to benefit from the kapara, he needs then to add an additional condition of tshuva and vidui. And when he adds that condition of tshuva and vidui, the chatos and the osham, which he had already brought, will be then mechaper. This is a chiddush nifla of the Briskirov that Rabbi Avraham Garbuz heard from Rebera. That the difference between mevayet v'kapara, where the carbon is not a carbon at all, afal pi shekarv, it's possibly a carbon posel. Whereas in the case of vidui and tshuva of a carbon chatos ve'asham, as long as he's not mevayet and he's shov, but even if he's not shov with the ikrei tshuva and the misvada of the Rambam in the beginning of Hilchos Tshuva, the carbon will be a carbon and it will be mechaper for him when he's shov a misvada. This is the chiddush of the Briskirov, as said by Rebera. In fact, we could add that the Briskirov in Zvachim stencil on Daf Mem Aleph says that the Tanai of vidui and carbon is just the Tanai. It's not part of the intrinsic avodah of the carbon. And therefore he says, even though ordinarily avodas ha-carbon can only be accomplished and performed by daytime, vidui on a carbon can be done by Laila, and the carbon can then be carved by Yom. Because says the Briskirov, the vidui on the carbon is a Tanai in the carbon, it's not of the ikra avodas ha-carbon. Nimtzeinu l'meidim from the Briskirov that we have a clear distinction between Einoi Shov u'mevayet and a Shov just who hasn't completed tshuva and vidui. So possibly we can suggest that that's what the Meiri means in the distinction between the categories of lo yeheir tachlis tshuva, whereas and the sugya of the Rambam that the soyer mishtalech is mechaper below tshuva. The lashon of the Gemara, as we mentioned in Shavuos, was that the Rebbe and the Rabbanon argue about oimed b'merdoi. In that case, where he wasn't shov at all, he would have the din of a mevayet b'kapara, in which case then the Rabbanon would hold that that's not a carbon at all. And therefore, even Sar Mishtalech, besides for Rebbe, the Maskonas had the Dvarim is Alpi Rabbanon, that the Sar HaMishtalech wouldn't be Mechaper. Whereas, as long as the person is not a Mevayet, and he's completed the condition of being Shov Mibi Tosoi, in that case, here the Rambam was Mechadish, that as long as he's not Oimed B'merdoi, Sar HaMishtalech is different than Shar Karbonis. Other karbonos, the Rambam says in the Hilchos Tshuva, won't be mechaper unless the person is shovu misvade. Whereas in the case of the Sora Pnimi, that the Rambam was mechadesh, it could be mechaper on kalois, even if he's shov to the extent that he's not mevayet, but isn't shov in the full extent of tshuva and vidui, as is mavur in the Meiri. In which case, we can conclude that the three dinim. Mevayet, which is equivalent to Oimed b'mardoi, where the Sara Panimi is only mechaper according to Rebbe. If he's no longer being Oimed b'mardoi, even if he wasn't Shov and Misvade, it will be mechaper on Kalois Lefi Rabbanon. And other karbonos, as the Rambam says Mefurish, their Zebach Rishon Teyeva will encompass, even in a case where a person was not Mevayet, but hasn't yet been Mekayim Ikra Tshuva. But the Briskirov says there's a fundamental difference. That if he was Mevayet ve'enoi Shov, the carbon is not a carbon at all. He has to bring a second carbon. Whereas in the case of a chatos v'asham, in that case the carbon is a carbon, and when he's shov and misvada later, the carbon will be oilelai. that would be the possibility of giving a precise definition for the two dargas of tshuva, which the Meiri uses to be miyashev the Lashon HaRambam. Just to conclude with a point in the avodas Yom Kippurim, not the avodah of Karban, but our own kiyum of Yom Kippurim, is that according to this Meiri, there emerges a chidush in the Rambam further. Because the Rambam says that Yom Kippurim, on the other hand, is not mechaper even on kalos, even on loisas, Yom Kippurim itself, without the soil, except with tshuva. Now, by inference, the following then emerges. If in the case where the Rambam says that the soil is mechaper below tshuva, it means not entirely absent tshuva, not oimed b'mordo. But al kaponim, he wasn't mayor himself tachlis ha'ara to be mekayim all the ikra tshuva. It then follows that when the Rambam requires that Yom Kippurim have tshuva, it means a tshuva gemura of all the ikra tshuva. So when we say that Yom Kippurim mechaper Yom tshuva, lefishitas Rambam al korchach, that would be Yom Kippurim together with a full ikra tshuva.